Hello, everyone, and welcome to Recapping AWS reInvent and a look forward to security trends in 2024. Today's webinar is sponsored by Rubrik and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Keith Ward. I'm with Actual Tech Media, and I'm truly excited to be your moderator for this special event. Now, before we get to today's great content, though, we do have a few housekeeping items that'll help you get the most out of this session. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in your webinar control panel. Now, Rubrik is here today and ready to go, so please ask away. Now, that Q&A panel is also the place to let us know about any technical issues you might be experiencing. A browser refresh is the first thing you want to do if something goes wrong. If you can't see something or hear something, just try to refresh that browser. If that doesn't work, well, try it one more time. If that still doesn't work, let us know in the Q&A and we will provide further technical assistance. Second, in the handouts section of your webinar control panel, you'll find a number of great resources. I'd especially like to call your attention to a link to the Gorilla Guide Book Club, where you can get access to Actual Tech Media's library of books on a vast array of technology topics. You'll also find a link to the Actual Tech Media Events Center, which has our calendar of upcoming events, including some really cool ones, which you should check out. If you see something you like, well, sign up right after the event. Third, at the end of this webinar event, we will be awarding a $250 Amazon gift card to one of you. Now, you do have to be in attendance during the entire live event to qualify for the prize. The official terms and conditions of the prize drawing can be found in that same handouts section. And with that, why don't we get to today's fantastic content? We have an exciting and timely topic today. And as the Rubrik team is here to recap their experiences at AWS reInvent, which just wrapped up December 1st. This is AWS's largest conference of the year with more than 2,000 sessions and 60,000 plus attendees. Yeah, it's a big one, all right. And Matt and Bill are here now. Welcome, gentlemen, and thanks for joining us today. Why don't we start with you introducing yourselves, and then it might be fun to kick things off by asking you to share your favorite experience from reInvent.
Sure. Thanks, Keith. Hey, folks, I'm Matt Castriata. I manage, along with Bill, our tech go-to-market for our growth products here at Rubrik. Excited to share with you what some of the innovations that we introduced here at reInvent. It was a great show, 60,000 people. The booth was hopping. Christopher McDonald, aka Shooter McGavin, was in the booth, and we had a lot of fun. And helping educate our customers along the way. Bill, over to you.
Hey everybody, Bill Gerling. Like Matt said, help manage the team with our growth products here at Rubrik. reInvent was a great time. Gosh, favorite memory from the event, I would say either sliding down the Datadog slide or checking out the show at the Sphere. That thing's pretty fantastic. Great to be here on the session with you and talking through some of the innovations that we announced at reInvent.
We're so glad to have you here, and we're excited to learn more about your latest offerings around Rubrik's Zero Labs report, complete cyber resilience for Amazon S3, and how Rubrik is helping organizations tackle their unstructured data protection challenges. I'll pass it over to Matt now to share more on these exciting topics. Take it away, Matt.
Hey, folks. So what I'm going to bring to you is an abridged version of what we had presented over at reInvent. In particular, a thought leadership around Rubrik Zero Labs and what we're seeing out in our customer base in regards to this data security. But before I do that, I wanted to cover a quick overview of Rubrik's technologies. At its core, Rubrik, you know, got its got its start in the data protection space, helping our customers to provide a resilient data layer so that they could get their data back if there were ever an incident, whether that incident was you know, a cyber event or if it was a disaster event. But in 2020, really most of the focus is on cyber, and along with that, as Rubrik has sort of evolved beyond resiliency, we start to talk about what forensic information can we provide from the backup to help you speed recovery and get your data back quicker. Things like understanding the any threats that might be latent in your data, or may have already detonated, and where the impact is and which files were impacted. Things like the sensitivity of the information, what type of data you're storing and who has access to it, and then the ability to be able to recover that data en masse, either programmatically or through the Rubrik Security Cloud, having the ability to spin up whole applications as a part of a recovery plan. This was really the evolution of the company beyond just data resiliency and getting your data back. What you're going to see and what you're going to hear from Rubrik over the next few months is our continued evolution beyond protecting and making your data at rest more resilient, and understanding what type of data you're storing and how you can reduce your risk vector, in terms of the types of data that you're storing. This Rubrik Zero Labs report really hits on the growth of our customers' data and the increased risk vector as a result of that growth and the type of data that our customers are storing. So that's what I'm gonna. This was really an eye opener for me to be able to deliver this to our customers and prospects over at reInvent, and hopefully it will resonate with you as well. First is growth, right? We're seeing that, in from July to July of 2024, we're going to have pretty minimal growth, somewhere in the range of about almost 100 backend terabytes, but that's going to balloon over the next 4 years to somewhere around 1.7 petabytes of backend terabyte data that our customers are storing with us. So this is gonna get out of hand very quickly, and along with that, sensitive data is going to balloon as well. Between the middle of this year to the middle of next year, we approximate about 10 million additional sensitive data records. But as I mentioned, that's going to quickly swell to somewhere in the range of 140 million sensitive data records over the next 4 years. So, along with the growth, our customers are going to be managing more sensitive information, and it becomes a question of how do customers reduce their risk vector as a result of having this much and this type of data, stored within their environment. That growth is going to happen mostly in SaaS and cloud, and on-prem is going to be lagging behind. And along with that growth, our customers' data security scores are not going to be growing as much, right? Between the middle of this year to the middle of next year, we only approximate our customers' data security scores. And these are scores, this is how we score our customers' data security posture. We only anticipate about a point increase in the score, and then up to 2028, approximate about a 4 point increase. That's not enough, right? We know that our customers' data security needs to grow, and we're gonna provide some strategies on how customers can essentially make that better. And in this Zero Labs report, you'll have it as a leave behind as a part of this webinar. I implore you to go out there and read the whole thing. It's a great read. Lots of great information in it. We really boiled it down to three recommendations. The first is you have to leverage data visibility to be able to proactively review the sensitive data that you're storing on a recurring basis. Where is it and who has access? That needs to happen. It's paramount to really securing your estate and securing your data at rest. The second thing, you got to be intentional about the growth of your data. A lot of data is disposable or recreatable, and if it has sensitivity associated with it, don't keep it around. It's just increasing your risk vector for the bad guys. It's really what the bad guys are after, is finding and exfiltrating sensitive data. It's not encrypting your data. So you have to be intentional about the data growth, understanding what type of if you have any redundant data out there, if you have any misplaced data, if you have any stale data, moving it through its life cycle and removing it from primary storage is really going to help reduce your risk vector there. And then the last piece here And this is really critical. Data security needs to be a specific focus area at the C-suite level. Having a chief risk officer, a chief data officer focus solely on your data at rest and the security of your data at rest is going to be critical moving forward, as we protect our customers' landscape. If we apply these recommendations, remember that 7x growth we showed earlier, we only anticipate that it's going to grow and only to about 57 million in 2028. That's a reduction of more than 117 million sensitive data records in a typical environment. Likewise, we're going to see a big reduction in the volume of data. We were anticipating in 2028 somewhere around 1.7 back in terabytes of data being stored. We expect an 1100 terabyte decrease in the amount of data being stored on primary storage in a customer's environment. And likewise, we expect our customers' data security score average will go up somewhere in the range of 7.4 points in 2028. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Bill, who's going to talk about some new features we have around cyber resiliency for Amazon S3. Bill, over to you.
Hey everybody, Bill Gerling here from Rubrik. Today I am going to talk through ransomware resilience for Amazon S3. Rubrik has recently launched some new capabilities that sort of help aid with defense in depth, specifically around mission critical data in S3. And what we really wanted to do here was just use some of the perspective that we have from the field and from what we've seen in the broader industry to highlight some best practices around securing S3 data from threat actors that are looking to, destroy, exfiltrate, and encrypt these data sets. And then at the tail end, we'll talk a little bit about how Rubrik can help. So to start, why even bother worrying about cyber resilience for Amazon S3? Traditionally, I think the perspective has been that cloud data sets maybe aren't impacted as much as traditional, data center assets. When these threat actors enter the environment and begin attacking, there's a broad misperception that the data is somehow inherently secure from this type of activity. So let's just frame the conversation up with the why first. If you look at the metrics out there, about 44% of all cloud data resides in S3. Amazon S3 is far and away the most ubiquitous data repository in the cloud, and it's continuing to grow. In fact, as of this year, somewhere in the area of 1.2 million customers use S3 day in and day out. And this is everything from startups, run by one person out of their home to, Fortune 100, Fortune 10 companies with petabytes upon petabytes, perhaps even exabytes of data in S3. And to talk a little bit about the data footprint here, this is as of 2021. So this metric is a little dated here since we're approaching 2024. There's about 100 trillion files in S3. And if you assume, I think it was an average object size of like 3 megabytes before, data duplication for the purposes of resiliency on the back end, you're talking somewhere in the order of 100 exabytes of data stored in Amazon S3. And this is growing day in and day out. And again, this metric's from 2021, so wouldn't surprise me to see, 200 trillion, 250 trillion objects in S3 today. Point being, because of the ubiquitous nature of this repository as a service consumed by cloud-heavy shops, it is a primary target for attackers when they begin snooping around and attacking AWS environments. It's got to be protected. It houses critical data, and its API is typically available over the internet, right? So unlike, say, a storage device like a NAS or a SAN in your data center, where you can kind of harden the perimeter and stop the control plane from being accessible, with S3, we've got to make sure that we're taking a thoughtful approach to securing these data sets, because there's tons and tons of sensitive data in it. And if an attacker gets something like a set of privileged credentials, it's very easy to intervene and manipulate. Okay, so to that point, what does it look like when S3 is attacked by someone in an AWS environment? Well, first, there's got to be a bad guy, right? Got to have a red icon. And that bad guy's got to get access to the environment. How they do so, we'll discuss in a following on slide here, but let's assume for the purposes of this illustration that they've gained access somehow to a customer's AWS environment. Generally, that initial access is going to be against something that's insecure, and typically something that is going to be insecure first is something like a secondary data set, like a developer asset. So here we assume that they've gained access maybe to a dev instance, and perhaps they've used the role to move laterally here and get at some storage services in S3, thus impacting the developer buckets. From there, they're going to try to elevate their permissions and they're going to try and move laterally, right? They're going to try and get access to as much production sort of sensitive privileged data as they possibly can. And once they've done so, they're going to steal as much of that sensitive data as they can, because by exfiltrating this data, they've guaranteed that they have a leverage point that they can use against the person they've attacked, regardless of whether or not they've got the ability to actually recover those data sets. Once that's done, can either be business as usual from sort of a ransomware perspective, where they encrypt the data and hold the customer at ransom for recovery of those data sets, or more commonly, especially for S3, they'll just destroy the data, and then they'll use those exfiltrated data sets in order to try and demand a ransom. And really what we see out in the wild these days is the assumption is that the expand footprint step really needs to be successful in order for a bad guy to get access to critical sensitive data. But in the real world, there's sensitive data all over the place. It spills across boundaries. It spills inside and outside the environment at times. And this is known in the industry as shadow data, right? Data that you don't know exists, but that does exist and that has two negative impacts on your estate. The first being it broadens the attack surface, right? So if these folks are after sensitive data and it's in an unprivileged environment, it's probably less secure in that unprivileged environment and easier to gain access to. And then secondly, it drives up cost because you have to pay to store these data sets. And if you don't know they exist, you likely don't want to be paying to store them. So we really want to try and mitigate this pattern. And we want to try and avoid and increase the difficulty of each of these steps so that we can better secure the environment against this type of attack. Let's drill into each step here and see how it happens specific to S3. Okay, so how does an attacker gain access to a target's S3 environment? There's a few different ways, and we're going to go through them in order of like least likely to most likely. So first and foremost, they can use what's known as a 0-day. This is the least common thing to happen to a customer because 0 days are extremely difficult to get a hold of. They're expensive and technically difficult to produce. Once you start using them, they're no longer 0 days, right? Because they're known to the market and they become what's known as a CVE instead of a 0-day. And so generally, you're going to see these leveraged by nation state actors who are trying to attack other countries, at times, multinationals. But it's very unlikely that you as an end customer are going to be impacted by a 0-day. The next most likely thing is an unpatched vulnerability, an unpatched CVE. And so what this is a system that has a known vulnerability, but it hasn't been remediated yet. And in terms of gaining access to S3, a good example of this would be maybe an EC2 instance that's internet facing, that has some vulnerability that can be exploited. It's unpatched. The threat actors are constantly scanning, AWS's IP space, trying to find systems that they can probe for weaknesses. When they find one, they can exploit it. They gain access to the underlying instance. Maybe that instance has a role assigned to it that has access to buckets in the environment. They could then use access to that instance to pivot towards the data in the buckets. Speaking of buckets, the old leaky buckets problem still exists here in 2023. And while much less common than at the inception of Amazon Web Services as kind of a platform, there are still public buckets out there. And if they're public and they're found, a threat actor can merely fetch data out of them. So hopefully we're all doing our due diligence today to try and avoid public or anonymous access to any data sets, but especially privileged data sets. And then lastly, and far and away the most common, is the idea of exposed credentials that are then swept up by the threat actor and used to authenticate into the environment. We like to say here at Rubrik that these days the bad guys aren't breaking in so much as they're logging in. And all they do is they parse, GitHub repositories, or in the event that maybe they compromise the system, they'll look at environment variables, so on and so forth. There's tons of places where they can just sweep up exposed credentials or possibly even phish credentials from an end user, and then use those to log in the environment and begin their attack process. From there, they want to conduct reconnaissance and move laterally. And we're going to talk about how they do that specifically in the context of S3 here. So first things first, they complete the last step. They log in, they impersonate a legitimate user. And at this point in time, unless you've got some governance and controls around user activity, it's going to be very hard for you to detect that they're doing this because it just looks like sort of a typical user logging in and doing things in the environment. And then from there, they're going to try and list all of the assets housing data in the environment. From an S3 perspective, this is as simple as a list buckets API call, right? If you're on AWS CLI, S3 LS, boom, there's a list of buckets. Now I can begin probing and introspecting each of them. And the way that I'm going to find out whether or not I have access to a specific object in a bucket is rather than trying to grab that object and use it directly from the outset, I'm going to use this head object API call. And what that allows me to do is it allows me to kind of check and see whether or not I have access to the object in the bucket without being as noisy as I am when I fetch the object and get access denied. So this head object API call, it just returns the metadata for the object. And if you get metadata back, you have access. If you don't get metadata back, you get access denied. From there, I can now inspect the objects that I have access to and begin probing them for sensitive data. In order to do that, I'm just going to fetch the object or copy the object and then begin analyzing it. Okay, so now we know what we've got access to, what we don't have access to. The next step is data theft and data destruction. Exfiltrating data from S3 is quite easy once you've got access to it. It's a web-facing service that's meant to be consumed over its API. It supports, massive amounts of data and parallelism, as we've just discussed. So all I need to do is iterate over the objects and either fetch them to some endpoint or copy them to another bucket that I own. And I've got a copy of that data that I now control. Threat actors can also encrypt data and execute a more traditional ransomware attack in S3. There are examples out there where attackers have used their own KMS keys, their own encryption keys, to put a copy of the object over the original object and to encrypt that copy with an attacker-owned key. From there, they can just delete all the previous versions, and voila, you've got sort of the cloud-native version of an encrypted file system brought to you by a ransomware threat actor. However, most commonly, what we see specific to S3 is just scorched earth, right? Destruction of all the data that the attackers can get their hands on after they've exfiltrated it. You can use deletion APIs to accomplish this. You can delete individual objects and then the buckets themselves. And then the last item here is particularly nasty. So S3's got this concept of lifecycle policies. And so you can say, hey, after some time period has elapsed, transition this data to a new storage class or delete it entirely. So with lifecycle policies, I can say if an object is older than some number of days, go ahead and delete it, trash it, right? And this can apply to previous versions and all of that stuff. And why it's particularly gnarly is because there are certain logging services that we'll go into in a moment here that log activity on S3 and that allow you to inspect that activity. The most common one is known as CloudTrail, and it's sort of like an API log on Amazon Web Services. And CloudTrail doesn't catch lifecycle transitions. So you won't see a bunch of objects getting deleted in CloudTrail if they use this lifecycle policy trick. You'll just see the creation of the lifecycle policy, and you have to use other methods to catch the actual deletes here. So that's the MO in terms of exfiltration and deletion. Let's talk a little bit about what this new pattern means and how we as security conscious organizations and practitioners need to think about cyber resilience, especially in the context of S3. So regardless of what happens after the fact, when someone breaches your environment and begins interacting with your workloads unbeknownst to you or against your will, that's known as an incident, right? And when an incident takes place, we just saw that these threat actors will either destroy data or exfiltrate data, but typically both. And what we have done as practitioners in the space throughout the past few years is we've gotten really good at recovering from the destruction path on this sort of nasty choose your own adventure here. And so we've implemented solutions like Rubrik. They give us a time series view of our data. They give us an immutable copy, an air gapped copy. one that is quick and easy to restore in place or out of place, granularly or en masse. And so these threat actors, they realize that if their only path to money is holding your data ransom and giving it back to you once you've paid, that if you have a good cyber recovery solution like this, they're probably not going to get paid very often. And that's where the rise of exfiltration and double extortion has sort of come to the spotlight here. And all these metrics that Matt was just reading off to you earlier in the session support this, right? That the new concern that we really need to be aware of is when an incident becomes a breach. When we go from just a bad guy in the environment destroying stuff to a threat actor in the environment stealing data and then destroying stuff. Because once the data is stolen, you can't get it back. You can't put the genie back in the bottle, right? And that's when we're in a breach scenario. And so what we want to do is we want to enforce a strong posture around our sensitive data so that it's really, really difficult for a threat actor who enters the environment to steal and exfiltrate sensitive data. And that's where sort of cyber posture and this idea of a data security posture management sort of approach comes to play. Really, you need a comprehensive solution that takes a holistic look at all of your data sets, but especially S3 data in this context, and that gives you both the resilience piece and the posture piece so that you know you can recover in the event of a destruction event, and you're confident that you're not going to suffer a breach when an incident occurs. Okay, so how do we stop it, right? Like, how do we prevent breach scenarios? How do we stop this sort of double extortion pattern? Well, there's four main things that we need to achieve. We need to eliminate unnecessary data because unnecessary data is unnecessary risk and unnecessary cost. We need to limit access to privileged data sets. So once we know where our sensitive data is and we've eliminated redundant copies of it, what's remaining needs to have least privilege access to it. We need to constantly assess the posture of the services housing that data and constantly correct any deviations from best practice from a posture perspective. And then we need to look at what's happening to those data sets day in and day out. And we need to be ready to react quickly in the event that something anomalous and undesirable happens. Okay, so first things first, how do we eliminate that unnecessary data? Sounds easy. One of the hardest things to do on this list, unfortunately, and that's because it requires a catalog of all of your data containing assets globally. Now, we're just talking in the context of S3 here. So in this case, it's a list of S3 buckets across all your AWS accounts. Not too bad to get, but you'd be surprised how many organizations out there don't know whether or not buckets exist in certain geographies or certain accounts, or even that certain accounts exist, right? We still have the problem of there's an org with a bunch of corporate accounts, and then someone swipes a credit card and has a standalone account. So we really need a comprehensive inventory of all data containing assets. From there, we need to scan those assets for sensitive data, and we need to understand that data, right? We need to classify it, categorize it. We need to understand the context that we found it in. And we need to understand what the legitimate use case and pattern for that data is, because we don't know what data is necessary or unnecessary if we don't know the legitimate use of that data set. There are some native AWS services that can help us here. Macy's called out, right? That'll help you classify and categorize at least your S3 data. For other data sets, you'll have to get them into S3 to use this tooling. But it can be useful for the scan and classify step of the S3 centric approach here. And then once we've done all this, we know what data is necessary. We know what data is unnecessary. And for that unnecessary data, if we're highly confident that it's unnecessary and just duplicitous, then we just delete it. For the stuff that we're less certain about, we always have the option to archive a copy off somewhere cheap and deep, encrypt it, access control it, all that stuff, and then delete the copy that we found. So this step right here, reducing cost, reducing risk, getting rid of that data that doesn't need to be present in the environment because it really does nothing but harm us. From there, now we assume just legitimate data sets in our S3 estate. We want to go through and we want to police up access to all of the remaining assets because least privilege is always a best practice. Again, we start with an inventory, right? And we know which data we have, we know which buckets we have, but now we need to know who has access to the environment. And that could be users that are locally defined or through single sign-on. It can be roles, which can be assumed by third parties, services within our estate, so on and so forth. It can be groups, that contain either of the former. But we really have to build that mesh of which service principals exist and who has access to what. So S3 identity and access management, not as simple as just looking at the policies on the users and roles and groups, right? Because we also have things like bucket policies and bucket ACLs, and it's sort of the coalescence of all three of these that grant or revoke access to some particular bucket and thus some particular data set. So we need to inspect all of these things and sort of resolve the end result of each of these policy sets, and that gives us a full perspective on which entities, be they internal, external, or anonymous, have access to our S3 data. And then from there, we want to reduce and limit access as much as possible. So if we have stale permissions that aren't used, get rid of them. If we have anonymous access and it's not explicitly necessary, get rid of it. If we have third-party services, applications, users, whatever, that have access to our environment, lock that down, restrict it as much as possible, because these are folks that we don't know and can't necessarily control, while they do provide a valid service to us, so they need some access. There's a service in AWS called Access Advisor. It can help you out quite a bit here, amongst other services. And then from there, we want to adopt best practices from an identity perspective. Roles instead of users, always. Why? Because users, when they interact with AWS programmatically, they use access keys. Leaked access keys, we saw earlier, number one vector for attack, especially with regards to S3. For those human users, MFA, enforce it. For any inactive, roles or users, go ahead and just eliminate those. We've got a credential report inside of AWS that can show us what's in use, what's not in use. We should audit that, and we should prune down access as much as possible. Okay, so now we've restricted access. That's actually a part of good data posture, right? Because least privilege, least access is definitely a component of posture. But there's more that we can do to strengthen sort of the posture or presence of S3 buckets in our AWS estate. First thing is encryption. Even if you're just doing server-side encryption with S3, access to the KMS keys that encrypt those objects is sort of another layer of defense against the threat actor entering the environment and accessing something they shouldn't access. They may have access to the bucket, but if they can't use the key, they can't access the data. And you can take this one step further and client-side encrypt that data as well. Then obviously any data in flight from point to point should always be encrypted. It's easy to enforce this within S3 and not allow unencrypted access to those data sets. The next thing we want to do is we want to log all of the activity. So we want to make sure that we catch every single action on S3. And that means using all three of these services here together for our most mission critical data sets, because those server access logs are going to catch things that CloudTrail doesn't, but CloudTrail is more real time than the server access logs. And there are some things it'll catch that they won't. And then CloudWatch allows you to look at things like puts and gets and amounts of data flow in and out of the environment. You can analyze that for anomalies. It'll allow you to react pretty quickly if something negative is going on, because you're going to see big spikes in sort of that type of activity when someone is attacking an environment directly. We also want to make sure we enable and test our cyber recovery capabilities, because that is still one branch of this attack pattern. And while a lot of us have it solved these days, a lot of us don't, right? So we want to make sure everything that should be protected is protected. That's typically known as a backup. Make sure that you have the right time series of recovery points, frequencies, and retentions are important, that those copies are immutable, that they're air gapped, and that they're observable, that it's easy to introspect them for the purposes of detecting anomalous activity or behavior, detecting impact to the underlying data, so on and so forth. And then we want to make sure that we enforce the resilience piece from an S3 perspective as well. That means enabling versioning where it should be enabled, using object lock when we can, especially for those recovery points that I just mentioned, as well as things like MFA delete. A lot of this you can introspect and enforce through services like AWS config. Okay, so now we've got the repository hardened, we've got access restricted, we know where our data is, we know where our sensitive data is, and we've gotten rid of any redundant or superfluous copies of it. From there, we just want to keep an eye on what's going on with our data sets, and we want to react quickly if something anomalous is going on. So a few recommendations here. You want to focus on your critical data. So on the last slide, we talked about having access logs and CloudTrail and CloudWatch, right? Well, for that critical data, even though CloudTrail can get a little pricey if you look at every single S3 operation, probably want to make sure we've got it enabled for our sensitive data, for our restricted data. And then we want to make sure that we're highly interrogating external and anonymous activity. And that's very simple to do as long as you've got a good analysis engine for those access logs and for the CloudTrail activity. And then we want to detect and respond to any anomalous activity. Again, especially on critical and sensitive data, and especially by means of anonymous or third-party users. And so some sort of like anomalies that we can keep an eye out for. Well, if a user account is supposed to be one user and they're in Texas, and then 15 seconds later they're in, Dubai or whatever, that's known as impossible travel. So we want to look at where the activity is coming from, and if it's supposed to be an individual entity using that that service principal or identity, then we know that something anomalous is going on and we should take a look at it a little bit deeper. Another thing you can look for is like suspicious user agent changes. So someone typically does something in the UI almost exclusively, and then they're using one or more SDKs to do something the next day. That could be anomalous, and we may want to respond and audit that activity. And then, taking a look at the sequence or frequency of events is also important. So I may have a user or a role that lists all my buckets a couple times a week or a few times a week. All of a sudden, they're doing it 100 times a day. They put and get a couple of objects here and there, and then all of a sudden it's hundreds or thousands or millions of objects being manipulated en masse. These are anomalies from sort of a standardized baseline. We should take a look at that and we should respond to that as quickly as possible. And then lastly, in the event that we do get impacted by an incident and data is encrypted or destroyed, we want to make sure we're able to recover quickly and efficiently. So that means making sure that you've automated data protection and data discovery, right? We have to know our data in order to protect it. And then once we know it, we have to protect it in accordance with business requirements. We can often use the attributes and the bullets here to make sure that we're applying the right level of protection. Always advise auto protecting at sort of a business baseline level, and then refining that protection more granularly so that even things that are untagged or not explicitly called out needing protection get that one baseline. So nothing goes unprotected. We want to make sure we're following cost best practices because people start unprotecting stuff or removing protection when cost goes up. So make sure we're not keeping instant recovery points we don't need. Make sure that we're life cycling data to low cost storage whenever we can. We want to make sure the copies we create are cyber resilient. Again, this is the immutability, air gapping, and observability piece. We want to make sure that we've got the ability to recover into a clean environment in the event of an incident. Maybe that means I want to be able to recover cross account to a whole new account. Maybe that means that I just want to be able to scan my environment for indicators of compromise or impacted workloads. And I want to be able to remove those things rapidly so I can recover in place. Your business will dictate your recovery process and requirements, but the tooling that you use needs to be able to support those business requirements. And then, when we recover, we want to make sure we can do so granularly or en masse. We want to make sure that we can get the config of the thing housing the data, not just the data, back in place quickly and efficiently. And we want to try and avoid anomalous recovery patterns, things that are unique and aren't recovered the same way as everything else. That's toilsome, error prone. And the last thing that you want when you're trying to recover from a cyber attack is some sort of complicated one-off process complicating everything at the worst possible moment. That's pretty much it in terms of best practices. Last slide I've got here is just how Rubrik and Laminar can help. So first and foremost, we've got an automated engine that does that discovery and classification piece for you without the need for any sort of explicit linking or data egress, right? So we'll build that data catalog for you, especially with regards to S3. And then on top of that, we're going to allow you to automatically apply the appropriate level of protection so that you get that time series immutable copy air gapped away from the source data set, just in case you need to recover from a cyber incident. Once we auto discover and build that data catalog for you, we're also going to classify and contextualize all of the data. So you'll know the sensitivity level of the data, as well as what sort of context it was found in. Was it found in a backup dump? Was it found in, a CSV file? So on and so forth. Again, low touch, easy, automated. We also give you the resilience component that you need. in order to recover efficiently from a threat actor, right? So this is, again, that immutable and air-gapped access controlled copy. We'll also tell you how risky your data is. So now that we've built the catalog, we'll marry that up with the posture and access piece, and we'll alert you when those two things are not well aligned. Highly sensitive data with a poor posture is highly risky, right? So you're going to get a critical alert when that occurs. Highly sensitive data with anomalous or anonymous access, as an example, would be a very, very critical alert. Whereas anonymous access to non-sensitive data or highly sensitive data that is well secured against external and third-party access, those are not going to trigger alerts. So that's what we mean when we say no alert fatigue here. There are a lot of posture tools that just light you up anytime posture is bad. We take that sensitive data context and we really refine that alerting. We also allow you to recover rapidly, whether it's in place, out of place, whether it's granularly or en masse. We can help you reduce access continuously, and then we can help you audit that activity. We look at all of those services that I mentioned previously, the access logs, CloudTrail, so on and so forth, and we'll allow you to introspect that quickly and easily in the context of sensitive data so that you can very rapidly discern whether or not someone is doing something undesirable specifically to sensitive data. And we do all this while lowering the cost of operating day to day. I've never met anybody that says their cloud bill was right where they wanted it to be or that they were hoping it was going to go up. And so what we allow you to do is efficiently transition those recovery points to cost-effective storage, as well as allow you to identify duplicate data sets that are exposing you to unnecessary risk and generating unnecessary costs in the environment. So really helping out with that eliminate a redundant data step as well. That's all I've got at this point. I appreciate y'all hopping on to take a look at some of these ransomware resilience best practices for S3. Hopefully it was insightful regardless. And if you're looking for a solution that can sort of ease the transition into a best practices sort of approach and posture, please reach out. With that, I'm going to pass it back to Matt, who's going to tell you a little bit about what we can do for NAS data with AWS. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Bill. Appreciate it. Yeah, as Bill mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about Rubrik for file data and how we can help with large file estates in AWS. So Forbes released a study here, and some other studies have actually pinned this number at a little higher. That 80% of data will be unstructured by 2025. As I mentioned, there are other studies out there that show that number to be closer to 90%. The end of the day, we all know that the majority of the data within the data estate is going to be unstructured, and that our own research shows that 66% of those respondents believe that the path of data growth, their trajectory of data growth has already outpaced their ability to secure and manage the risk of that data. And Bill went through in great detail some of the tools that we can use to discover what type of data might be at risk. And then respondents, 98%, according to our own research, of respondents believe that they currently have very significant data visibility challenges. So this is across the board, not only for object data, but also for file data as well. And going to give you a little peek into kind of what Rubrik is doing for file data. We know that the common protection methods, particularly for large file estates, it falls short. It falls in really two categories. It's either legacy protection tools like NDMP, or it's snap and replicate. And as we know, that snapshotting, all of the snapshots are under the credentials of the array. If they can violate those credentials or obtain those credentials in any way, then those snapshots can be compromised. As well as replication, yeah, that's going to do a great job for business continuity and disaster recovery, but it's not going to protect you from a cyber event. If there's a data destruction event in the primary, that's going to show up in the replicates as well. So we know that these protection methods are not sufficient in the cyber age that we live in today. And because of that issue, we know that there's a better way. You need proper backup of your file data. You need to be able to do it across different, in a vendor agnostic way, across different vendors, and to be able to put the data in the target storage of your choice. And there's nothing better than Rubrik NAS Cloud Direct. It's a stateless VM. It's alongside the source, and it does three things very, very fast. First, it scans the data to figure out what's changed. It indexes the data that it scans so that you have full file level recovery capabilities, and then it moves that data at wire speed to the target storage of your choice. And that target storage can be S3, hot tier in AWS. It could be some of the colder tiers within S3. It's a great way of getting your data out to the cloud and doing it at wire speed across what could possibly be hundreds of petabytes in your data estate here on the left-hand side. And we know that you got to be complementary in this world, and the ability to be able to migrate data in its native format to from file repositories on-prem to Amazon S3 enables a whole bunch of use cases, particularly use cases around AI and large language models that got a lot of attention at reInvent this year, as well as use cases around just the ability to be able to analyze that information and some analytics use cases around it. We also know that file services are moving to the cloud. Amazon's fastest growing storage service is FSX. It is file based. So having the ability to be able to protect those file services in AWS and then orchestrate the movement of those files to a cheaper tier of storage is going to have huge cost benefits to our customers and obviously large benefits from a cyber perspective. And then having that easy recovery, right? The ability to be able to get that data back, whether it's been exposed to SysMB or NFS, and get it back either from on-prem to a cloud file resource or vice versa, really being able to do it in a vendor agnostic way across storage platforms. And this is really what NAS Cloud Direct can give you. So as I mentioned, that stateless VM does those three things really well. The target can be any target that you think it works for your organization. It could be something on premises. It could be the public cloud. In the case of AWS, it'll also be Rubrik Cloud Vault. Rubrik Cloud Vault is our managed storage service. It is natively air gapped and immutable. And can isolate that copy of file data from your own credentials. So there's a lot of benefit there. Some of the other benefits of moving that data to Rubrik Cloud Vault include the ability to monitor for change and a malicious change, whether that's files that have been encrypted or data that's been deleted, and being able to identify if there's any sensitive data in that estate. Being able to turn on sensitive data monitoring and management across the board are some other benefits of storing that data in Rubrik Cloud Vault. So again, storage agnostic both on the source and the target. It is aware of the latency on the source, so we're not impacting that source NAS system or that source file system. We will work in a multi-threaded way. It will scan, index, and move at the same time across different data sets, obviously. It will can index up to billions of files and give you that incremental forever backup. And then we can also give you the ability to be able to air gap and credential isolate that data to thwart off ransomware. And as I mentioned, back up to any on-premise NAS, or even if it's cloud storage or Rubrik Cloud Vault. So just a recap of some of the NAS Cloud Direct capabilities. One of the big ones that goes underrepresented here is Data Discover. Data Discover gives you the ability to understand what was the last access time and access patterns of the data within your estate. And Bill had mentioned this earlier in his talk. It's really important to understand what is critical and what is not, especially when we talk about these large unstructured data estates. So Data Discover just is another set of data points to be able to understand what data should I be protecting, what data should I let die on the vine, and then what data should I archive off or move through my data lifecycle policies. And then giving you the ability to archive that data and migrate that data, and again, move that data at wire speed up to 20 billion objects scanned in 7 days, moving up to 50 billion objects in 14 days. This is a scale that's unheard of. 700 terabytes in 14 days without any hardware. This is really the strength of NAS Cloud Direct. So I'd implore you to go out to the marketplace and check us out. We have a marketplace listing. So go out to the marketplace, check out NAS Cloud Direct. Also check out some of our collateral on our website. And with that, we'll hand things back off to the moderator to for any closing remarks or questions. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Bill and Matt, for a fantastic and illuminating discussion. We really appreciate your time and insights today. It was just a pleasure to have you on. Now, before we wrap things up, though, we do have one more piece of business to take care of, and that is the Amazon gift card prize drawing. And the winner of the $250 Amazon gift card for this event today is Harold Raynar from California. Congratulations to you, Harold. We will be in touch with you ASAP to get you that gift card. And with that, everyone, we're wrapped. On behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank Rubrik for making this event possible. I want to thank always you attendees for being here, for your great questions, for your interest in this topic, for spending part of your day with us. It's always the highlight of my day to be here with you. So thanks again. That concludes today's event. I'll see you in the next one. Have a great rest of your day.